Happy Future Fridays. Arianne, I'm so excited to have you here. You have been an incredible friend in women's circles, but also in the space of blockchain, as you have been a long time builder, one of kind of the earliest members of the Cosmos ecosystem, and a managing director at Interchain Foundation. You're the VP of Finance at Tendermint, and now you're the COO of Informal Systems, which is building a whole array of portfolio of collaborative systems that I can't wait to dive into, particularly Ko-Fi, which I'm so excited about. So thanks so much for joining. I can't wait to dive into your story and how you got here. But first, where are you calling in from, and what's your main focus these days?
Yeah, so I'm currently in LA. Thanks for the intro. As you said, I'm the CEO of Informal. And so, Informal more generally is one of the core contributors in the Cosmos ecosystem. So we really kind of cross the entire Cosmos stack. So, we work on everything from the lowest layer consensus engines all the way up to kind of the software that allows different blockchains to talk to one another, all the way up to like the software building for the Cosmos Hub, which is one of the largest blockchains in the whole Cosmos ecosystem. And, I'm really cross everything that we do. I really focus on kind of, I say like the non-technical side of things. So my role is really at the intersection of kind of people, business, and computers, so to speak. And so Informal, while we're a core contributor of the Cosmos ecosystem and network, that really underpins everything that we do. But on top of that, we have some really unique and interesting kind of business lines. So we have a proof of stake validator. We also run a security auditing business. And then, as you alluded to, our latest endeavor is called collaborative finance, which is really like an exciting way of how we think about connecting Cosmos to kind of the real world and going after what we think is the killer app of a lot of this technology, which is money. And so thinking about how do we create a more equitable and sustainable monetary system.
For people who may not be familiar, just what is the basic mission vision of Cosmos? Like, what makes it distinctive of all the different protocols out there?
Yeah, I mean, Cosmos is essentially an internet of blockchains. So rather than having this kind of one blockchain to rule them all approach or mentality, it really values more sovereignty and allowing people to make their own individual decisions while connecting to the whole. So really how, the internet went from intranets within companies to being able to connect to one another. That's kind of the Cosmos philosophy, and allowing people to make their own decisions, have their own, autonomy and sovereignty while also connecting to the larger whole. So I think that's really what makes it unique. And it's not, trying to capture everything. It's trying to give individual projects that ownership and sovereignty that they might be looking for.
So your background, I love. It's so amazing how you went from basically like sales trading analyst, fixed income at Credit Suisse, so like really financial, into co-founding something called Head Ahead, which was a people-to-people tutoring marketplace. And then being the associate director of something called Machine Learning Ventures at the Creative Destructive Lab. So really building in this world of AI. And that was like in 2015. Now it's like just starting to become a massive trend at this intersection. And then you applied that as the director of finance of something called WatrHub, which was basically a predictive market using AI to figure out how public documents would help predict and create sales and market insights of where like water utilities would show up and where to invest. And then that kind of part of your chapter is around like 2016 to 2018. How do you go from this world into the world of blockchain?
Yeah, it's I've definitely had a very non-linear path in my life, and I personally think that that's been really valuable because I get to explore and see things in so many different ways. So frankly, I really fell into the industry totally by accident. So as you mentioned, I worked at a lab at the University of Toronto called the Creative Destruction Lab. And I worked in their when they were just first starting this machine learning and AI commercialization arm. And so this was like very early days. in like the AI world, it wasn't actually that early. I mean, people have been doing this research for decades at this point, but it was really one of the first kind of times we saw the commercialization of this and so on. And that's where I met Ethan Buckman, who's one of the co-founders of Cosmos. And so, we got to meet, we stayed in touch and so on. And I had various different roles after that, where I was exploring different things in different industries and so on. And, in I guess 2017, we kind of got in touch again and he was like, hey, we need some finance help. Would you be interested? I knew nothing about this world, what they were doing and whatnot. And I ended up going to San Francisco to meet a lot of the team who was out there at the time. And, I kind of just fell into it from there. Like I really loved working with, this was very early days. Like it was, a handful of people sitting around just like, shooting ideas and so on. And it was the really early days of builders. And I just really loved the people I got to meet and how everyone was so passionate, idealistic, but also really hard working and trying to apply those ideals in a reality. And, what you think one day you learn changes a million times, and what you think is going to be the expression of what you want to build always is evolving. But that's what really got me hooked, was like, I was like so interested to be able to work with and see people who are so committed to what they do, so passionate, really like had a grand vision of what they were trying to achieve versus just, doing a job. And so I kind of fell into it a bit by accident. But I've been lucky to kind of have like a lot of experiences that taught me different things along the way. And obviously there's a lot that can be translated into, helping me do my job well today.
One of the things that inspires me most about that early story was how you confidently claimed your space at a time where it was heavily weighted to like the technical capabilities. And maybe to just share a little bit of like, what did that feel like to like walk into an environment where, you're one of maybe like the first 5 people working on a protocol, and not being technical, and like, how did you find your place to add value and feel confident of your role in that environment?
It's very hard to kind of navigate the ecosystem occasionally when you're not technical, but also there's so much opportunity to add value and you don't need to be a technical person to do it. Because the gaps between like, hey, I'm just building and hey, I need to run a company is all the in-between stuff that developers aren't going to take care of themselves, nor do they want to. And, when I was working at Tendermint Inc., which is also called All in Bits, the two co-founders were technical. They didn't want to be dealing with like treasury management and contracts and payments and all of the things that come with running a company that is, it can be very complex. It can be a lot of overhead and so on. And so I really joined as one of the first kind of, I think as the first kind of formal ops role. And there was a lot of, gaps to fill. Definitely never found it challenging to find a place. But what I think is particularly interesting, kind of like in a ops and finance role in a technical industry, is like you're constantly trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, because it's not like there is some playbook already defined on how to, run a blockchain company's operations. Like you're using best practices to think about like, hey, what tax treatment do I use for this? Because no one's defined it before. Or how do I run like a totally global and remote company and so on? And you have to kind of like figure these things out on the go. And, I'm lucky now to be able to like help reduce the time to learning for other people kind of in those roles. But when you're first doing it, you really have to figure a lot out. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for people coming in from like non-technical positions to add value and support, rather than just pure from the development perspective.
So cool. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I love how you bring up the fact that like there's no limit to the gaps that you can fill. And there's a lot of things to do operationally. What do you think has been the most valuable thing you've learned?
And I mean, there's learning every single day. You never stop, always like surprised by something new. But I would say like there's two really important things that I feel like I've learned kind of over the last couple of years. The first one is to be really thoughtful about picking your battles, because from like a software perspective, from a mission and vision perspective, it's so big and we want to reinvent so many things. You have to be really diligent about how much you want to reinvent all at once. So, I've seen a lot of companies experiment with different company structures or paying everyone the same, or, doing all of these unique flat hierarchies or all of these unique models and things. And frankly, we do a lot of, this kind of thinking and forward-looking experimentation in informal. But I think that it's like so crucial that you do it very, very slow and very meticulously, because trying to change too much at once just leads to like total utter chaos. And so I think it's like you have to stay focused on changing the things that are really impactful and really matter. And then the other thing that I think is totally crucial, that I have learned in the industry, and I think is more important than ever, is that like cash is really king. And it's so critical not to get wrapped up in kind of like the paper crypto fluctuations, and really assume that like everything will crash, 90% at any given point. Because it has, and we've seen this happen all the time, over and over and over. And so this isn't new. And that's really how I approach things at Informal, is like making sure that we have really stringent treasury management processes and so on. Because at the end of the day, if you have these like long-term life-changing missions and visions, you need to be sustainable and around for that. And if you can't like pay people to do that in the long run, how are you going to achieve that? So I think that that's like a really valuable lesson that we've been lucky, to not have suffered from or anything like that. But I know a lot of companies have. So I think it's like a stringent and, sustainable treasury management process is really, really critical.
Can you give like the 3 top things you think are important to treasury management? Because I think a lot of people talk about that, but then what that actually means in practice can be so diverse. Like it can be having like distribution of like what tokens are within the treasury. It can also be about like when you sell and convert to different like USDC or like stable coins. Can you just talk about like what are the top 3 things that like keep you up at night that you really pay attention to when you think about treasury management?
Yeah, I think like it's really important to capitalize on the upside so that you can protect your downside. So, in the events when everything is in a bull market and all the prices are going up and so on, it's really important for me to have like limits on which it triggers sales. So, if certain assets are above a certain threshold, you should hedge that out to cash. Similarly, I think it's really important to classify kind of liquidity of your various holdings. So, is something low liquid, like if you dumped it all, or you like were, selling all at one time, how would that affect the market? Would there be like buyers and so on? So I think there's definitely like different approaches there. And that's kind of how I don't know if that was 3, but it's, that's kind of how we approach it, is making sure we have clear cash requirements and making sure that we are setting kind of limits by which we would trigger sales and so on. And so that creates a structure of rules such that we're always making sure we have enough cash on hand that lasts a certain amount of time. So in the event everything went to zero, we know we could survive, sort of thing.
Is there some sort of like strategic planning process that you guys go through, and like each of your business lines or like projects and those leads are set to like set up forecasts so that you can predict the cash flow requirements, not just in terms of cost, but also in terms of cash in and like revenue, or however you perceive it? Because I think that's been really interesting to me to see that like a lot of times it's perceived that to predict the revenue side is too difficult, and sometimes it stays at this level of like aspirational, like world changing, and then doesn't get to this sort of like tactical cash flow, cash in, cash out. So I'm curious like what that looks like.
Well, it depends. Like for us, we have different, business lines that have different revenue models. And so we think about the revenue models kind of per business line, and some are pre-revenue. So like Ko-Fi is pre-revenue. We know that we don't expect significant amount of cash in. The security auditing business is a very straightforward, business where we can say, this is the cash in, these are the margins and so on. So kind of per business, we try and look at like, what is the expected like service revenue, so to speak, for the year. And that's very predictable, right? Like pure service revenue, we can say like, here's a forecast of what we expect for, service revenue. With say a validator business, that's much harder because the revenue earned on a validator is through commission, and that is generally quite tied to crypto prices. So, typically how I'll approach that is to do kind of like low, medium, and high estimates so that we have kind of a band of what we're looking at for the year, so that we're not purely thinking about like crypto speculation or so on. And then typically I'm like very conservative as it relates to crypto or crypto upside. Like I always want to assume very little. So we're not like relying on that purely from like a cash perspective and so on.
Are there any like hot takes or like unpopular opinions that you feel like you hold that some people might disagree with you on about where you think the future is going, especially within the context and ecosystem of informal systems and the things that you're focused on, particularly maybe even Ko-Fi? Like, what do you think the next like 5 to 10 years looks like that other people might disagree with you?
A very like easy take is that in bull markets everyone thinks like all things crypto are the messiah, and bear markets everyone says, oh, you haven't done anything yet, and so on and so forth. So I think that is inevitably, that kind of narrative is inevitably going to continue, but I think that like inspiration comes through resilience, and I really think that like those people who are so inspiring are those who continue building during those periods of maybe unpopularity and so on. My hot take, frankly, about kind of the market more generally, is that I think the world is very, very hard for millennials and younger generations. And, I think our parents' generation, like accumulated, if they were lucky, were able to accumulate a lot of wealth through like the real estate market and so on. Whereas I think like our generation is stuck, with unattainable home prices, high inflation, and so on. And I think that this market, not from a speculative perspective by any means, but from like a what it could achieve perspective in the long term, because it could be so fundamental in restructuring the utility of so many things in the world, could be like one of the few massive wealth generation events for kind of our generation to exist, because there's so few asset classes that allow that at this point. And also it's just, the potential utility and upside of that impact could be really game changing kind of for our generation.
Are there any individuals or companies that are really inspiring you in the space right now? Especially in Ko-Fi, which like just to share is like this idea of collaborative finance, right? And to your point, like that is the killer app. It's money right now. What do you think is like really visionary? What's happening in that space that people listening should like keep track of or take a look at?
I think like on that side of things, it's there's a lot of interesting companies. We're working with I'm blanking on the name right now, but a company in a partnership in the UK to kind of put a lot of these, collaborative finance principles into production in kind of real world economies. And I think that that's like, there's other companies, like Circles and so on, also working in this field. And I think that at the end of the day, as it relates to Ko-Fi, and also I think the industry in general, it's like resilience is really what inspires me. And I think that the people who have been working on things for a really long time, despite it being, not sexy or not getting the attention that it deserves right away or so on, but being able to say like, I really believe in this. People who we work with at Informal have been working on these kind of systems for a really long time. It just hasn't like been brought into the mainstream yet. And I think being able to, demonstrate that resilience in order to, seek it through and be able to kind of bring some of these ideals into more mainstream, whether that's through blockchain technology or not, is very inspiring.
I love it. And how can we keep in touch with you personally as you're leading in this space, evaluating other projects, and then also with Informal Systems and just the broader Cosmos network?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Informal, you can follow us on Twitter. We're pretty active. It's just at Informal Inc. And then I'm not a big Twitter user personally, but I'm always, around. I do stay up to date on LinkedIn and so on. But yeah, follow us on Informal and you can always stay up to date on what we're doing there.
Fantastic. Well, I definitely will. And you're such an inspiration of like the resilience you've had in the industry and the role you've played as like a really anchor female in building a hugely important and relevant protocol that exists in the world to good day. So I'm so glad to know you. I'm so glad we had this conversation, and I can't wait to stay in touch.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Arianne.